Hey everyone, a quick word before we start the show to say a huge thank you for tuning in and for your ongoing support of Looking Outside over the last few years. If you do enjoy the program and you get value out of it, please take a second to give it a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you tune in. Subscribe to the YouTube channel or give it a like. It truly makes a huge difference to get the algorithm to get it in front of more people. And it means a lot to me. So thanks for tuning in. Keep the feedback coming and enjoy the show.
There's this sense that efficiency and productivity, it's associated with these kind of rapacious corporations dredging dollars out of the dirt. But if you make more food per acre, you don't need as many acres to make food. And we are losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest to agriculture every 6 seconds. We cannot keep expanding agriculture's footprint. We need to be more intensive rather than more extensive.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Looking Outside, where we explore fresh takes on familiar topics. And today we're talking about a very familiar topic, that is our modern day food system, which maybe on the outset appears to be quite stable, maybe even predictable, certainly forgotten about on a day-to-day basis, but is actually quite fragile, flawed, and unsustainable with the land that we have. So today we're going to talk about that with journalist and author of We Are Eating the Earth, Michael Grunwald. Huge welcome to the show, Michael.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Pleasure to have you on, especially after I just finished reading your book, which I highly recommend. It's a really nice balance actually between being a very journalistic, endeavor into the modern day food systems and the way that we think about land use, but also has a lot of kind of personality, I would say, personality and humor, and starts off in quite an unexpected way.
I mean, a topic like this, our food, our land, our farms, our planet, it's kind of weighty stuff. And, you want to make the medicine go down a little easy. So I definitely, I tried to work hard to make it compelling and fun so that people don't feel like they're slogging through.
Yeah, it's definitely a fun read. So you have succeeded, but you have a ton of experience writing and investigating deep, complex topics, and then obviously, communicating them in a compelling and engaging way, which might be a good time to allow you to, do a little bit of an introduction into who Mike is.
Oh, thank you for your kind words. That's great. Yeah, I mean, I'm a reporter. I'm a hack. I've been, I spent like 30 years in corporate media, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, then Politico Magazine. And now I guess I'm just an unemployed guy. I write occasional contributor to the New York Times, and I'm freelancing. But this was my third book. I wrote one of sort of history of the Everglades in Florida, another one about President Obama and his sort of Economic Recovery Act. And now this about how to feed the world without frying it.
Although arguably the world is already frying, right? Like the world is warming. So I guess that was the really interesting thing for me when you were kind of starting to explore this topic in the book, is I was thinking, how is the broader topic of climate change and the fact that our food system is becoming harder to maintain just because of the warming planet and unpredictable yields and things like that, with the way that we're approaching it from a commercialization, from a business perspective, is those two topics seem like they're sort of at odds with each other, but deeply connected, right?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, my book is mostly about how our food affects the planet and our climate, about, the way agriculture is eating the earth. But as you mentioned, our climate affects our food as well. And since, one of the real takeaways from the book is that we are going to need to make more food, about 50% more calories by 2050, with significantly less land and about 75–80% fewer emissions, then this question of yields is really vital for everybody in the food system and everybody outside the food system. And, we're going to have more heat waves, more floods, more droughts, pests and crop diseases are going to be moving to different regions. There's talk that wheat yields could come down by as much as a third over the next 25–30 years. And that's a disaster because we're going to have to increase yields even more over the next 30 years than we've increased them over the last 60, because we're going to have to make more food over the next 30 years than we've made over the last 12,000. So those are really important business considerations as well.
And a little bit scary, right? Like how are we going to I think one of the stats that you have in the book is we'll need to expand, yeah, agriculture production by 50% by 2050 to feed the planet, as you say. I mean, is that actually achievable?
I mean, sure. I mean, that's, one of the lessons of the Green Revolution, right? Is, because of, better seeds and then GMO seeds and irrigation projects and synthetic fertilizer and chemical pesticides and factory farms as well. For all their downsides, they help us make a lot of food. Over the last 60 years, we have tripled our crop and livestock yields. And so since the main theme of the book is that basically our natural planet is becoming an agricultural planet, that 2 of every 5 acres of the planet are now either crops or pastures. Well, if we needed 3 times as much land to make that same amount of food, I guess it would be 6 out of every 5 acres. In other words, we would actually need that planet B that environmentalists are always reminding us that we don't have. So yeah, it is going to be tough. Because, like I said, we're going to have to do even more to increase yields. And a lot of the low-hanging fruit has already been picked, right? 93% of the farmland that is really kind of irrigatable, if that's a word, is already irrigated. So, we can't solve this problem by just expanding irrigation to new areas. We're going to have to come up with new things, whether it's, gene-edited crops so that they're drought tolerant and higher yield, or biopesticides that I write about, biofertilizers, a lot of really exciting technologies, as well as on the demand side, ways that we can waste less food, eat less beef because cattle really are the baddies, alternative proteins to replace meat, which we ate 450 million tons of last year. So again, there's a lot of hope, but one of the big messages is that it's going to be really hard. Because if it was easy, we would have already done it.
Yeah, and I think people get very enamored or very excited, let's say, by innovations that they feel like are going to be like a quick fix inside of the food system. I was at a conference in Germany where I had some questions from people there saying, like we're doing personalized nutrition and we're doing vertical farming and all of these sorts of things that are like still very small on a on the grand food scale, right? Like they're not going to solve the problem, at least not right now, and they're probably going to evolve quite substantially before they get to a point where they can have a significant contribution into the food system. But I think a part of that is that people maybe don't understand how hard it is to solve the problem at scale, that a lot of these things that are starting to come in to drive innovation in the food system are just going to take a really long time.
That's exactly right. I mean, I feel like I couldn't have said it better and I didn't. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I write about really dozens of some, I think, very exciting solutions for pieces of this problem. But honestly, none of them have achieved scale yet. None of them are really moving the climate needle. And so that's kind of depressing, but it's also kind of a call to action, right? I'm the guy sort of waving my hands in the air, banging my spoon on my high chair, saying this is a real problem. And yes, like alternative proteins would be the kind of maybe the most important example, the kind of fake meats, where I actually started my reporting in 2019. I went to the Good Food Institute conference, which was sort of bringing together everybody who's working on whether it's plant-based meat or cultivated meat made from cells or, mycelium meat made from fungi. And Beyond Meat had just gone public, and it was, it's crazy. People thought we were, there were real arguments. Are we going to get rid of the meat industry in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? My joke was that I thought I was going to accidentally raise a Series A round on the drinks line. But of course, then the bubble burst. And I went back to that same conference in 2023, and it was all doom and gloom. What were we thinking, that we could take on this $2 trillion entrenched subsidized industry? Maybe this was just a fad. And honestly, I think, the answer is It's going to be hard. This stuff is
Hmm.
not going to be easy. We are not going to immediately change the diets of eight heading towards 10 billion people and 600 million, probably heading towards 800 million farmers. There's still, the cow is a pretty mature technology and fake meat isn't. So it's going to get better. It's going to get cheaper. It will hopefully get healthier. And it is, that is something that I'm hopeful about. But certainly the people who said, like, this is going to solve everything, no, and certainly not right
Yeah.
away.
No, and it was really interesting being inside of the food system at the time when all of that kind of crashed. I was working at McDonald's and we had a lot of people kind of saying, told you so, the like we knew that this thing was just a fad. And then other people being like deeply, deeply disappointed because there were parts of the business that obviously and even today are still investing in that and are
Well,
hopeful that we're making strides in that space.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing look, the basic story is right that the dogs didn't like the food, right? I mean, these things came out. Beyond Meat went up to $250 a share because people were like, "Oh my God, this stuff is like way better than those vegan hockey puck burgers that from the
Mm,
old days. This is actually
mm,
something made for people who aren't vegan, who might like meat, and that could actually move the climate needle, the animal welfare needle, the antibiotics needle, all kinds of needles, right?"
mm,
But then it turned out like it wasn't as good as meat, right? But making something that's 90% as good as meat and maybe only 50% more expensive is a real technological achievement. These guys, it's incredible what these guys did, but there's also for most people, it's not attractive to buy something that is more expensive and not as good. So that's
mhm,
why it hasn't
mhm.
really done very well yet. But they can make it better and they can make it cheaper, and then maybe it'll do better.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people in that space, I mean, you list a whole bunch of them inside of the book, are doing great things now to try to evolve with like genuine passion for creating a product that does meet all of those expectations, that does cook well, that does smell good, that tastes good, that is sustainable, that is healthier. And I was actually hoping in the book that you would write about Eura, which is the Barcelona-based organization. I had the CEO on the podcast, Mark Coloma. I'll link it into the episode here, who is really passionate about using transdisciplinary science and technology to be able to create an alternative product. And I mean, his company is just one example of so many in that space that are kind of putting their hands up now, right? Saying, yeah, like the founding fathers of this movement maybe overstated or maybe we're a little bit too enthusiastic. But there are people in that space now that are legitimately trying to progress it at a slower and a more careful, perhaps, pace.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of overhype. There's no doubt about that. And I tell some,
Mm,
I think, kind of fun stories about some of these, kind of the rise and fall of some of these companies. Beyond Meat went from $250 down to $2 a share. And there's
mm,
a scene in there where I tell the CEO that, I don't like the burgers and that they smell like piss when you cook them. And and to his credit, he was he was not defensive. He was like, yeah, we got to get better. What he said at the time was that we were like Wang when they had computers the size of this room, and we're going to get we need to improve the technology. And one thing I do say is that humans, we kind of suck at being nice to each other. We're not great at making sacrifices for the planet, but we're really good at inventing stuff. And, I have this thing in my pocket that I can, video chat with anybody anywhere on the planet and look up any fact known to man in seconds and also use it as a flashlight. And I think like 10, 15 years ago, people would have said that's impossible. And even like 10, 15 years ago, we had no like solar power or electric cars were a rounding error. There was a movie in the United States called Who Killed the Electric Car? And today, people sort of acknowledge that's the future. Solar is taking off. We're having this clean energy revolution. 95% of the new electricity around the world last year was wind or solar. So again, I think we this is something in my business, in the media business, we tend to, we pump it up, we knock it down. And I think investors are the
mhm,
same way. There's a lot of herd mentality. But the fact is, some of the reviews of my book have talked about how I write about all of these, promising solutions that turned out to be duds. And I'm kind of like, I wouldn't say they're duds. They just haven't panned out
Mm,
yet. Some of them will be
hmm
duds, but some of them will change the world.
Yeah, and I love how you also contextualize that the food system is built on innovation, as you said, as like fixing or finding the problem firstly, and then fixing the problem. This problem right now that we have is limited land, growing population that we're
Right.
feeding quite poorly at the moment, right, with all of the waste that we have inside of our food system. But then also this ability that we have as humans to be able to invest ahead of the curve in new ideas, essentially, and experiment, like build the plane as we're flying it, sort of. There's a something that you say in the book, which is that I think it was in that plant-based section, plant-based alternatives or cell-based, that it was a research project disguised as an industry, which I love, and I think it just like perfectly articulates what's happening, right? That when you have this highly innovative, highly nascent area, and it might be plant-based, it might be for vertical farming or regenerative agriculture, which are other areas that big business is getting kind of interested in and behind, or behind quite significantly in many ways, that it is still in many respects a research project. So you're going to be making hypotheses and debunking them. You're going to be getting a lot of things wrong that the science is not fully, vetted.
Yeah, well, certainly there's some fake it until you make it, right? I mean, a lot of these, particularly in the fake meat space, there was a lot of money raised, right? Basically by food companies pretending they were tech companies, when at the end of the day, you can't send your product to market by like pressing a button and just ones and zeros go, just flit around the world. You actually have to make a factory and make a product that doesn't spoil. And doing that on a venture capital timeline, I think was maybe a little silly. But that said, a lot of great work got done. A lot of that, and if they hadn't told those kind of crazy stories about how, I'm the Amazon of eggs, or I'm the Uber of meat, or, whatever they were putting in their pitch decks, they wouldn't have gotten, the kind of money to start doing some of this research. The New York Times ran a op-ed, these are my bosses. They called cultivated meat the revolution that died at dinner. It died on its way to dinner. And they were like, oh my gosh, $3 billion of venture capital flushed down the toilet. Which, first of all, like, I think it's like a little early, right? The entire industry is just literally 10 years old. It was founded, the first company was founded 10 years ago, while even like, solar took, 50, 60 years to get any meaningful part of the market. But also $3 billion is like nothing. That's in its entire history. There was $500 billion spent in the solar industry just last year. So again, I think we're very early. I wrote this book because I got this sense that essentially like, that food and climate and food and the planet generally was this massively important and massively neglected issue that people weren't really grappling with. And I was kind of saying like, hey, we need to grapple. But one of the cool things, and you mentioned this, is that, going around and meeting scientists, entrepreneurs, engineers, all kinds of people who are really working on solving these problems. And again, that's another thing that humans are good at, right? Like when we put our mind to a problem, we're pretty good at solving it. I was kind of saying, hey, we got a problem. People are acting like
Mm-hmm.
energy is our only problem. But, agriculture is what's using more than 2/3 of our fresh water and is our leading driver of water pollution and our leading driver of deforestation and wetland destruction and biodiversity loss. And oh, by the way, it's also a third of our climate problem. And it's getting worse every day, unlike energy, which we're at least, we know what we need to do and we're even starting to do it. So again, I think there is some sign, I think, that people are starting to take this seriously, and there are a lot of exciting possibilities. I'm not I'm too honest a reporter to say that any of them really have much traction, but I'm still really hopeful.
And I think that's partly what's really, really refreshing about your work is that you are like, you're not in it for anything. You're not, like a consultant. You're You're kind of here to piss everybody off and find solutions for everybody, right? Like you have no kind of stake in the game other than hopefully helping to improve the food system. But I can't imagine that you would have pissed like the innovative and the startup founders off and the big food companies and institutions.
I seem to have pissed everybody off. I think, I certainly, if the point of this book was to make a lot of friends, I do not seem to have succeeded. Maybe you though. That's nice. You've said like we
Well,
can be
yeah.
friends, but no, it's been crazy. No, the hippies are mad, the foodies are mad, the Aggies
Mm,
are mad.
mm,
And I grew up in New York, and we had a mayor, Ed Koch, who used to say that if you agree with me about 80% of the issues, you should vote for me. And if you agree with me about 100% of the issues, you should be in an institution. um, and
mm.
uh, and I sort of feel like a lot of the people who agree with me about 80% of what I wrote are just, you know, really pissed off about that 20%. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think for big business who are like, and I'm talking like the Fortune 500, the really big players that are investing quite heavily are trying to foresee the major issues that will destabilize their industry, like cocoa supply, like coffee bean supply, the dairy industry decline in farmers, like all of these, let's say, core ingredients that go into the products that we all love and maybe take for granted. They're like shit, let's look out 2050. We might not even be able to source them. So they're trying to invest in the right areas. But I think, like, as you also point out in the book, there are a lot of dumb ideas out there. Companies are not very good at taking a lot of risk. And then I think sometimes they invest in areas where they think it's a big solve for all of the problems, but maybe they need to tread more carefully. So I guess the challenge for somebody inside of an organization is like, well, crap. Now I know it's even more complex than what I thought it was before. Mike is telling me that these areas that I thought were going to pay out are actually probably not the right way to go. Like, what do I do?
Yeah, that is again, I'm not always the bearer of welcome news. I mean, there are definitely some inconvenient truths in this book. I mean, the big one right now, the big excitement in in big food, big ag, the United Nations, the environmental community, the philanthropic community, everybody's pushing, this big regenerative ag movement, soil health, carbon farming, that basically we're going to, through these regenerative practices, all that bad carbon that we've pumped up into the sky is going to be magically repatriated under the soil as good carbon. And, we're going to fix global warming, and agriculture is going to stop being part of the problem, and it's going to be the solution, and, et cetera, et cetera. Let's go see these movies with all these celebrities, Kiss the Ground, Common Ground, Jason Momoa and Giselle Bundchen, and you name it. And I'm the guy sitting here like I'm the skunk at the garden party saying like actually the science sucks, particularly of carbon farming, that's not going to work, that sorry, General Mills and, PepsiCo and, and the Rockefeller Foundation and, the Nature Conservancy and, the World Bank and everybody who's kind of banking on this to save the world. So, yeah, I mean, I do tell some stories in the book about people, and this was in the context of bioenergy, which is another big scam. But I talk about like one scientist, one environmentalist, and one public official who was a big fan and then looked at the science and realized they were wrong and changed their mind. And I really wanted to highlight that because I think that's another thing that humans aren't so good at. We're not great at admitting when we made a mistake. We're not good at accepting information that challenges our priors. And I think inside a business, it's particularly hard, right? When if something was supposed to solve your scope 3 emissions problem, and here comes Grunwald saying like, actually, no. Who wants to be the one saying, at the meeting saying like, well, actually, maybe we're doing it all wrong. But I don't know. I've sort of made a little bit of a career out of trying to zig when other people are zagging. And I'm always sort of surprised by how willing, everybody is, especially in the investment world, like venture capital. It's like, my God, like it's just like mindless groupthink. You'd think there would be a kind of advantage, particularly in business, for doing something good that everybody else isn't doing and ditching something bad that everybody is. So,
Mm.
hopefully some people will look at this and say like, huh, we got to take a new tack.
Yeah, well, one of the things that you do call out, which I think maybe like I, I don't think any company would be brave enough to go down this route from a positioning perspective, but is a really important element of this, which is efficiency is a good thing.
Yeah.
Scale and the efficiencies gained from scale are a good thing. They feed more people. The argument that big doesn't have to be bad, but a lot of these organizations, this is the very argument that they are faced with from people who, like, they might even love the brand, they might eat the products from the brand, but because it's industrialized in a way, it's commoditized, it's, maybe there are some shortcuts made throughout the production process that don't make it like the natural way that people assume food is made, like magically, chocolate milk coming from brown cows and all of that kind of stuff.
Right.
They assume that it's a bad thing that you have these big, really, really big organizations that are literally feeding millions of people every single day. This is not necessarily a bad thing.
Well, I do think that's right. I mean, there's this a sense that efficiency and productivity, it's like it's associated with these kind of rapacious corporations dredging dollars out of the dirt. But there's kind of a very simple thesis to my book, which is, partly like if you make more food per acre, you don't need as many acres to make food. And we are losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest to agriculture every 6 seconds. We cannot keep expanding agriculture's footprint. And essentially, what I'm saying is like we're already using an entire Asia plus an entire Europe worth of land to grow food. And we can't grow more, right? We need to be more intensive rather than more extensive. And yeah, that leads you into some like, some sometimes uncomfortable positions, right? Because, there's this sort of Michael Pollan idea that we need to go back to, sort of old style farming that's more natural, it's kinder and gentler. The soil is treated with love and the animals have names instead of numbers, and there aren't so many of these nasty chemicals. And that there was this real kind of environmental disaster of agriculture was intensification into these, horrible factory farms and, chemical drenched monocultures. And there was some environmental cost to doing that, right? With the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico from fertilizer in the Mississippi Valley, and some pesticides have created real problems. And it's true that like factory farms treat animals badly and they treat people badly, and often their politics suck. But they also make a lot of food, and that's what factories do. They manufacture a lot of stuff, and the real environmental disaster of agriculture was the transformation of nature into those nice Michael Pollan farms, right? The rustic, romantic ones with the red barns and the farmers in the overalls. But that's when we lost the carbon. That's when we lost the biodiversity. And really, the goal of agriculture should be to feed the world without taking up more land. And that's going to mean efficiency and that's going to mean productivity.
It's kind of sad hearing that, like going back to why people maybe sometimes get a little bit depressed reading your book because these are the realities. But that image that you painted, when you were talking about a small farm and, that every animal has a name, like you get this really nice warm feeling inside, like that's the
Right.
way it should be, right?
Yeah.
But we're not going to feed
EIEIO.
the 10 billion people on Earth if that's the way that we go, unless something else drastically shifts. So, for example, if we curbed the massive amount of waste that we have in the food system today, then could we produce less if we're more efficient with how we distribute it?
Yeah, I should say the math really sucks. So I do talk a lot. The two big problems on the demand side are, basically meat, particularly ruminant meat, beef and lamb. It uses 10 times as much land as poultry or pork, and food waste, because we waste a quarter of our food, and that means we waste a quarter of the land that we use to grow the food. So we use like a land mass the size of China to grow garbage. And we also waste all that fertilizer and water and labor. It's terrible. But and there's a lot that can be done and that needs to be done on that. But even if we in the rich world reduced our meat consumption in half, and in the entire world cut food waste in half, we would still need to make more food with less land. And so when you see this sort of valorization of, like, there was a New York Times article just a couple of weeks ago about kernza, which is this sort of regenerative grain it's kind of like wheat. And it's grown, it's much more natural, it's perennial, it has much deeper roots, it doesn't require all that fertilizer and pesticide. And it's, so lots of really nice things about it. And Patagonia is putting a lot of money into putting it in their beer, and General Mills wants to put it in their cereal. And then you get to the 40th paragraph, and it's all wonderful. In the 40th paragraph, they quote this asshole, Michael Grunwald, pointing out that Kernza's yields are 1/3 of wheat yields. And if you're going to grow Kernza, you're going to have to grow 3 times as much to make the same amount of grain. You're going to need, you're going to have 3 times as much deforestation. And so I think there are a lot of uncomfortable truths. We saw, everybody hates pesticides. Everybody hates synthetic fertilizer. Well, Sri Lanka banned them. And what happened? Within 6 months, their farm yields crashed. They had food shortages. They had food riots. The government fell. The president had to flee the country. It's like, food is tough. There are trade-offs. And I do think that a lot of people who are just kind of like, oh, there's an easy solution. One thing I will say is the people who are always saying like, oh, we just need to waste less food, or like, we don't need to make more food, we just need to distribute it better. Those people are never working on food waste issues or food distribution issues. Those people are always working on basically, usually it's some kind of low yield farming. And their idea is like, we don't need to make more food because somebody else is going to solve the problem. It's not the people actually working on the problem.
Yeah. You said this in a podcast I listened to yesterday, where you said like, yeah, everybody else should do that, but not me. Which is the same thing as like, if we know that a substantial amount of food waste goes through the household, like, are people actually taking action to even just curb their own behavior or become more aware of how the food system currently works? If you're going to be creating different solutions that use land, you're going to be taking that land away from something else. You're going to be cutting down those tropical rainforests. You said it before, we lose a soccer field's worth of tropical forest every 6 seconds. It's really sad.
Yeah. And it's ag. And I think people don't, you don't think about it when you're eating your burger, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe some people think that they're eating a cow, but you don't think that you're eating also macaws and jaguars and the rest of the cast of Rio, right? You're eating the Amazon, you're eating the earth. And to answer your question, no, people are not changing their behaviors. They are actually eating, like in the rich world, we're eating about 1/3 less beef per capita, but not because we want to take care of the earth. It's because chicken got cheap. We're eating more meat than ever. But eating less beef has been really helpful. But like in the United States, we still eat 4 times as much as the global average. And, the average American eats the equivalent of 3 burgers a week. And if we cut that to 2 burgers a week, we would save a landmass the size of Massachusetts every year. And food waste, it's the same thing. You're actually starting to see some improvements on the business side. Groceries in particular are doing a much better job through supply chain management and using AI and, and various technologies that kind of help them, basically put stuff on sale when it's starting to go bad, or before it goes bad. There's a lot that people with an economic interest are doing to sort of reduce food waste in the supply chain. But in households, it's funny, or maybe it's tragic. In the United States, the biggest issue for the last sort of 4 or 5 years has been food prices. That's our biggest political issue. And that's what made President Biden unpopular. And now it's one reason that President Trump is unpopular, because food prices, particularly like ground beef and coffee, it's continuing to go up. But one very interesting thing that, the dog that didn't bark during the pandemic when food prices start to go up is that people did not waste less food, not in their household and not at restaurants. And in the United States, the average household wastes like $2,000 worth of food a year. And
Mm.
as pissed off as people were about their, how much they were spending at the grocery store, it still didn't bug them that they were throwing out a quarter of it every time, or at least not enough to
It's
change.
no, not enough to change behavior. Or the trade-off in making a little bit of extra effort of like tracking your food and being creative with cooking it, etc., wasn't enough. It's really interesting that meat consumption is growing, right? Because I think like we do see this growth of flexitarian diets and meat reduction and all of this, but you're right. I mean, I was looking this up. I mean, obviously you have all the data, and I don't know how you keep all that the stats and the data in your head. You must be like a I don't know, memorization machine up there.
It's like
It's
5 years of work, man. It
very
was,
it's very impressive. Very impressive. But yeah, I was looking at global beef consumption has risen in absolute terms over the past few decades. Obviously, much more in the middle income regions and those parts of the world that are growing in income,
exactly.
and especially in Latin America, Asia, the US, Australia. Unfortunately, like we love our beef.
Yeah.
And I know that like you said that you personally have reduced or cut out your
I
beef
don't eat beef
intake.
anymore. Beef and
You don't
lamb,
eat
I've
beef.
cut out. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Um,
Which like
I
I
still eat
heard
chicken and
that.
pork though.
You still eat
Yeah.
chicken and pork. Yeah, yeah. So, like for me, I'm kind of going the opposite way. I've cut out because I used to be a vegetarian for 6 years and I did it really, really badly. So I'm like, the least I can do is just cut out some animals today. So I don't eat, as people like to make fun of me, I don't eat the animals that are smart. So I don't eat pigs and I don't eat any cephalopods, octopus, etc. So I guess that's the other thing that kind of popped into my head when I know that you've been doing a lot of interviews where you say, reduce the animal consumption that makes the biggest climate impact. Then how do you balance, I guess, in all of this, the more ethical considerations?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is that these are ethical considerations, I think. Like to me, like obviously, climate change, like even though I live in Miami, where there's, sea level rise, maybe we're going to go underwater, but in general, I'm going to be okay. The real victims of these problems that I'm writing about, not just climate, but, the expansion of agriculture at the expense of the environment generally. I mean, it's like indigenous people in the Amazon and smallholder farmers in Africa and, low income people living in the floodplains of Bangladesh. Like those are the people who are going to get screwed. So I do think this is like the environmental issues are ethical issues as well. But I think it's a perfectly good point. Like, eating less beef and more chicken is like better for the earth and better for the climate, but it sucks for the chickens. And chickens are treated worse than cows. And I'm again, first of all, like I'm not even a vegan, so I'm in no position to, be shaking my finger at anybody. Like I think everybody finds the level of hypocrisy that you're comfortable with. And perfect usually isn't on the menu, but better is better than worse. Like I have solar panels, I drive an electric car, but I fly way too much. So we all have impacts. And then what I would say is that I'm trying to put out information. And yeah, my book comes at it mostly from an environmental perspective so that people know the impact of their diet on the earth. But if it's more important, if you care more about animal welfare, that's totally fine, And there are trade-offs and people have their own priorities, but I think for too long people haven't even been aware of this stuff. And so I think it's good for people to know that beef uses 10 times as much land, per calorie or per gram of protein as poultry or pork. And that cattle really are the baddies from an environmental perspective. They are spectacularly inefficient converters of their feed into our food. But you can kind of take that or leave that. I try to encourage people to eat less beef or at least stop feeding your pets beef and lamb. Or, there are lots of ways you can make a difference, but it's up to you. You know, I'm
I
not
think
going to
it's
be
a
I'm not going to be the asshole saying like, so and so is a bad person. It's like these are personal choices.
Yeah. And I think the broader message of like, what can you do? I'm curious on your take on that because I think a lot of people are very wedded to traditional ideas of what a food is. Like people don't even think about food half the time, I don't think. They don't know where their food comes from. They don't appreciate farmers and I think farmers rightly have the kind of their backs up about that. And a concerning element of all of this is the decline of farmers. So as we're thinking about, obviously more intensive agriculture and farming and producing food in a more efficient way, that does still rely quite heavily on the traditional farming kind of career path that modern day agriculture has been built on. And we are seeing this decline of farmers in almost all parts of the world. It's generally like a generational thing, right? Where you pass it on to your kids, and these kids are not wanting to be farmers. Is that something that you saw in your research as being kind of a concerning element of this as well?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I have a kind of, obviously a lot of farmers are mad at me too, and I
Sure.
get it. Partly because they're used to getting their asses kissed, because certainly in the United States, there's this idea that like, bipartisan, like Democrats, Republicans, right wingers, left wingers, buffalo wingers, right? Everybody loves the farmers. They're the heartland of America. They're, the hardworking soul of the country. And they are subsidized, coming and going, like, for everything they do is subsidized, and they are like exempt from all kinds of environmental regulations, even the regulations for how many hours a trucker can drive without taking a break. There's an exemption if they're carrying agricultural deliveries. So it's really like the farm lobby always gets its way in America. And so my approach, which is kind of like, hey, they are businessmen. And I will say the ones I've spent a lot of time with them, they are mostly like excellent businessmen, smart businessmen, competent businessmen. And what they do is kind of a miracle, right? They turn sunlight and soil and water into nutrition. And it's amazing. They do a great job of it. That said, like collectively, they're making a mess. This idea that they should be treated differently than other businesses, like, if certain older people are getting out of the business and they're selling to larger farmers or swallowing up smaller farmers. We don't really get upset when that happens in the convenience store business or the, small manufacturing business. It's only when they happen to be manufacturing food that it becomes a whole issue. And so I really am sort of pushing for farmers to be treated more like with respect for the excellent and indispensable job that they do, but also and we should be helping them achieve our sort of public goals for the food system. Like we want them to make even more food, we want them to do it with less mess. How can we help? Instead of globally, they are given $300 billion worth of agricultural subsidies every year with virtually no strings attached. And so again, I don't think that's good public policy. And as I said, it's like eating the earth. A lot of them feel like they're good stewards of their land, but, collectively they're stewarding a mess. So how can we help them steward less of a mess?
Right. And the stewarding part also then comes back to the big organizations, many of whom are listening to this podcast, and giving them the right sort of guidance and support to be able to produce the food in a way that we know it is aligned with what the world
Right.
needs. It's a little bit of a
And
chicken and egg, and I'm sure you've heard that
But
many
part of
times.
it, but part of it, right? I mean, you mentioned before that like we discussed a little bit about how this is kind of unpopular, this idea of
Mm.
efficiency and productivity. But who it isn't unpopular? Who likes it? Farmers and
Mm.
agribusinesses. Like, they make more money when they make more food per acre. And in fact, yield, the old joke is like, what are the farmers' top three priorities are yield, yield, and yield. And I'm saying like, great. How can, we want even higher yields. Efficiency, it's like, the JBS and Cargill and Tyson's of the world. Like, that's to the extent they have an ideology, that's it. Right? It's like
Mm.
we want to be more efficient. They have very thin margins. How can we cut our costs? How can we increase our production? And so I think there is a lot of common ground. They don't necessarily like the part where I say that every farm is a kind of environmental crime scene. Um,
And stop
but
making a mess. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
but
Maybe not. Maybe not.
I get it. But again, it's like all of this, this mess would be really unconscionable if it wasn't for the fact that we need to eat, right? It's not like they're making a mess because they like to make a mess. They're making a mess because they're making a product that all of us want, that all of us need. And so, again, I don't think there should be finger pointing. And I also don't think there should be this kind of like hagiography where it's like, you're a saint because you're growing our food. It's awesome because in America, 1%, maybe 0.5% of us are farmers. That makes it so the other 99% of us can, write books or be doctors or bankers or, influencers or you name it. That's a really important service and they should be respected for that. But they're also paid and subsidized for that. So again, I think, we don't have to, it doesn't mean that we need to just sort of write them a blank check from the public treasury.
No, but I do think that you're right that what they do is magical. I mean, the entire food system and the way that it has evolved human beings is quite incredible. Like food plays such a bigger role in our lives than I think we kind of take stock of. I mean, yes, obviously, like it brings us a lot of pleasure. It's a social connector. It passes down heritage and tradition. It literally sustains our bodies, but it also helps us to evolve as a collective society, as a culture. And so it's really interesting to think about the next, 50 years or 100 years based on what's been happening in the last 1,000 years and the amount of innovation and investment and curiosity and idea generation and technology that could fuel the food system to improve in the decades to come.
I think that's a really good point, right? It's become such a cliche, right? Like our broken food system. And I hear that all the time. And I'm always like, well, what's broken about it? Like, and parts of it are like, wasting a quarter of our food. Like that's dumb. It's not like, nobody loves food waste. So we should, and there are a lot of really smart people working on that. Yeah. Like, the main thing I think that's broken about it is that it just keeps expanding spatially. So we got to work on that. Yeah, I think again, on the nutrition side, I know sort of just enough to be dangerous. And I think people would say that that our food system's making us sick. That there's too much of this ultra processed junk. And again, what I try to point out is that like Doritos and Twinkies, they're not bad for you because they have like GMO corn or like monoculture corn or because it was like industrial agriculture corn. Like they're bad for you because they're Doritos and Twinkies. Like you could grow it like organically and it would still suck. So I do think there's that is not like that's a kind of processing issue. From an food and agriculture side, I really think like a lot of the system is not so broken at all. We just need to make it even better and more efficient and definitely less extensive. I worry because a lot of the, particularly regenerative or organic agriculture where all the energy is, the average organic farm has 40% lower yields, that means they need 40% more land. They eat 40% more of the earth. And I think in the business world, where they're often thinking about what's going to be the limiting factor to growth, I think in the food business, land is going to be the limiting factor to growth. And ultimately there is going to be demand for, there's going to be a need, or maybe it'll be reflected through prices that, land hogging foods are going to get more expensive to the extent that we start caring about the environment and the climate. And that's something that I think business people are going to have to think about. But it doesn't mean that like the entire food system's broken. It's just like, okay, we need to shift that.
Exactly. Maybe then the priorities of an organization need to also shift towards paying more attention to that. And just hitting on that point, because I think it's a really powerful thing again in the book that you wrote, which is that urban sprawl is a rounding error. A lot of organizations are focused on mega cities and urbanization and 80% of the population living in a city, where you say half of land that isn't ice and desert is cropped and grazed. Right. Like
That's right.
most of the
Yeah.
land that we have is going towards agriculture, not towards building apartments.
No. And that is, agricultural sprawl is about 40 times larger than urban sprawl. I always like to say that for those of us who live in cities, we will take a cross country flight and we'll look out the window and see all those rectangles and circles. And we're kind of like, wow, there's a lot of agriculture out there. And not to make my 300 pages sound like incredibly simple and obvious, but the main point of the book is there is a lot of agriculture out there. It is like, and it really is this notion that that the earth is becoming more and more of a farm, and 3/4 of that, farmland is an animal farm. That's sort of a giant, huge fact that maybe people sort of know, but don't really think about the consequences of. And I think, if we thought about the consequences of our land use, I'm essentially talking about a new land ethic where land is sort of valued for its ability to produce food, to store carbon, and it's also to, its ability to, support our cities as well. But that's really a small part of it. Most of what's happening on our planet is happening in nature or in agriculture.
And if you care about nature and you are wowed at the beautiful sights of our natural planet as you're flying, consider that more expansive agriculture means less expansive nature, as you say, like in the book. So, what's next for you? I mean, like, I know that you're obviously like deeply ingrained in this topic right now, but this isn't your entire career. You've researched so many other things. Are you working on something that's in a completely different space now?
No, in fact, because, I used to, like, again, I was mostly I've been a policy reporter of all kinds. And then when I wrote about the environment, I wrote a lot about energy and climate, which is really how I stumbled into this. I kind of realized that I was spectacularly ignorant, so other people probably were too. And then I spent 5 years basically in my cave learning everything I could about it. And now I feel like I know some stuff. And so I'm going to be writing about, about the food system, about land and agriculture and climate and the environment for a while, I think, because I really do feel like, it is a little bit of a siren issue that people are starting. I feel, and I will say it's been really gratifying since the book came out. Maybe not so gratifying, all the people yelling at me, but I did say that I wanted people to grapple with these issues, and they're grappling, right? I mean, sometimes they're grappling upside my head, but this is what I wanted, and so I do feel like I want to be in that mix right now. So at some point, I'll find something new and go down a new rabbit hole. But for right now, I'm enjoying this rabbit hole.
Well, I think you're adding a tremendous amount of value to it, and the new land ethic. I can't wait to read more about that. So right now you're going deeper. So I guess final question for you then is, how do you look outside? How do you gain a different perspective when you're in this kind of rabbit hole on this topic?
I thought about it. It's such a great question. It's a great theme for your podcast too. I think it's very cool. And for me, I guess like I said, I'm a journalist, and in this case, I came into this issue as a spectacularly ignorant journalist. And the beauty, though, of journalism is that, you read stuff and call people and become less ignorant. And this was really a process. Like, my way of looking outside was to talk to everybody on all sides of these issues. And even though everybody's angry at me now and saying how biased I am, or, I'm a sellout for the meat industry, or I'm a vegan militant, or I'm in the pocket of big ag, or I'm not enough in the pocket of big ag. I don't know. I've heard it all. I literally did, I came in with no preconceived notions. And so my way of looking outside was sort of to look everywhere and just to, I visited, four different countries and, I think 9 different states while I was working on this book. And I probably talked to about 2,000 people, plus, my main character, who I like to joke, I've been on the phone with him for the last 5 years. And so I do think that this idea of, people may not have nobody's challenged any of the facts in the book so far, knock wood. And, when people, to the extent they don't like the analysis, it came from an honest place of really trying to find the truth. And so I think, so much in our political world generally is so ideological. And to my surprise, a little bit, I found that food and agriculture has also become quite ideological, where you have the vegans and you have the Aggies and the foodies and the hippies and, the climate people and, everybody's in their own silo, I guess would be the agriculture pun. And I really tried to, come at it just from a facts basis. And I think that's really the most important thing, to try to have an open mind and be fair about this stuff. You learn new stuff, which is way more interesting from just having your priors confirmed.
In your honest search for the truth, you've gone out and spoken with people with very different perspectives, which is
Yeah, that's
perfect
for
way
sure.
to bring the outside in, and maybe piss some people off, but I think definitely opened a lot of eyes and made a lot of fans, including me. So thank you so much, Mike.
I really appreciate it. Keep up the great work.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, or share the show, and I will see you next time. Until then, keep looking outside.